Okay, the author's experience with a ghost light on a country road. Just before sunset one evening in the summer of 1953, I was finishing chores on our farm in Iowa when I heard screams coming from the country road at the end of our lane. There was still enough light for me to see three teenaged girls pedaling their bikes as fast as they could manage on the loose gravel. Before I could get to my car and drive down to investigate whatever it might, just looking at the time, have been that had so frightened them they were nearly out of sight. Although we had a long lane, our rural community was small enough for me to be pretty certain who the girls were, so the next time I went to town, I located one of them and asked her what had caused them to scream as if their very lives were in danger. According to one of the girls, the three friends had decided to go on a twilight bike ride in the country. Just as they passed our lane, a large ball of glowing greenish white light rose up out of the ditch and began to bob about near them as if checking out each one of them individually. They screamed and turned their bicycles around and headed back toward town, but the ball followed them for about a quarter of a mile before it turned around and left them. I listened with polite interest to the spooky story. I was 17, a high school graduate for 2 months, so I could indulge the wild imaginations of three 15-year-olds. I was quite certain that the three girls had been frightened by a cluster of lightning bugs that had risen up out of the ditch. However, a couple of nights later, as I was driving home in my 1948 maroon Ford coupe, I was startled to see a greenish-white glowing orb of light bobbing ahead of me squarely in the middle of the road. The orb appeared to be about the size of a volleyball. I didn't have time to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting the thing, and I had no idea if it would explode if I struck it or smash in the front end of my car. To my everlasting surprise, the strange illuminated orb passed through the windshield of my Ford, remained a few moments directly in front of the steering wheel, right at my chest level, then moved around me to pass through the rear window. Although it had appeared to be a solid ball of some luminous substance, it had passed through the windshield and back window of the car without causing the slightest bit of damage. And whether it just thought it was fun to scare the bejabbers out of me, or if it was on some mysterious mission, the ball of light waited for me near the same clump of trees on the next 2 evenings. On those occasions, it merely raced beside the driver's side of the Ford, accompanied me to our lane, then sped on its way off into the distance. Although I did not see the mysterious glowing orb again near our farm lane, I did have a similar encounter with such an object in 1985 while driving late at night in the desert country of Arizona. On this occasion, the ghost light shot in front of my car, then angled at great speed off the road and disappeared among the sage and cactus. Interestingly, in 2001, I learned via an email from the wife of one of my high school buddies' sons that the greenish ball of light still manifested from time to time along the country roads of my hometown. Brad Steiger investigates the glowing ghost of a Midwestern mansion. In July 1970, medium Irene Hughes and I brought a group of researchers to a university city in the Midwest where we encountered a glowing spirit entity that so impressed itself on the psyches of certain members of our investigative group that for years afterward they reported awakening from nightmares, fearful that the ghost was forming again right in their bedrooms. Because the mansion that was home to the ghost had since been torn down and a new house built on the estate, I have changed the name of the previous owners and omitted the identity of the city in which the mansion was located. My friend and associate Glenn had received the lead on this particular house from some police officers. Before the house had been vacated, two elderly sisters had lived there alone. According to a number of police officers who had themselves witnessed the appearance of the ghost nearly every night, a glowing something would manifest in a lane that ran alongside the house. Then the manifestation would walk up to the house, enter it, and interact with the sisters. On several occasions, the police had received calls from frightened neighbors who had seen the thing. These people thought the police should do something about the spook light, but the officers who responded to the call really didn't know how to handle what they assumed to be some kind of ghost. They would just sit in their squad cars outside the house and watch the two elderly women talking with the glowing light. After one of the sisters passed on and the other was taken to a nursing home, the ghost light continued to appear at the mansion. On the first night we arrived in the city, our host suggested that we drive out to take a look at the ghostly sight. It was midnight by then. Glenn was driving my station wagon and he edged it cautiously into the lane of the estate. The headlights picked up the image of a wooden gate bearing a sign containing a strict warning that trespassers should keep out or risk being prosecuted. Glenn said that he had arranged for the caretaker to meet us at the estate the next day. He had also requested a police officer to accompany us just to be certain a passing squad car didn't pick us up as vandals. Irene complained that it appeared as though we had entered a jungle. There was a heavy overgrowth of weeds and bushes. Thick, drooping branches of untrimmed trees virtually blanketed the narrow lane. Glenn said that from our present position, we wouldn't be able to see more than the edge of what had once been one of the city's loveliest estates. What's that? I don't remember who first saw it, but no one had to point out that the dark and quiet scene was suddenly interrupted by a glowing intruder. There appeared to be a very large orb of light moving in front of us down the lane. The moon was covered by clouds that night. Glenn turned off the headlights, and the strange orb glowed brightly in the total darkness. The nearest street light was completely cut off from the old estate by the thick wall of trees. As we watched the orb of light move toward the old house, everyone turned to look at Irene, who was seated in the middle of the back seat. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I noticed a rather strange expression on her face, and it had occurred to me that she had been extremely quiet during our excitement over seeing the ghostly figure. Shall we go right now and investigate the whatever it is? Someone wondered. No, Irene answered firmly, breaking our silence. Not tonight. I have a very bad feeling that it would not be good for us to walk down that lane right now. There was a certain tone to her voice that indicated that she meant exactly what she said. Her psychic impression told her that the time was not right to invade the darkened lane and approach the shimmering orb that seemed to be moving toward the deserted house. Let's leave now, Irene said suddenly. No one argued with her. On the second night, we approached the eerie mansion. It was nearly midnight once again. Earlier that day, in the company of the caretaker, we had walked around the house and allowed Irene to pick up psychic impressions about its past inhabitants. At first, the caretaker had been very skeptical of what Irene was attempting to do. He had been quite reluctant to take time for such foolishness, and it had required a good measure of Glenn's persuasive abilities to convince the caretaker that he should bother with us at all. It was most interesting to watch the caretaker's obvious change of attitude as his exchange with Irene brought him deeper and deeper into a mysterious territory whose boundaries he had never before dreamed of transgressing. He knew that there was no way Irene could have gained such detailed and personal information about the house and its inhabitants, but somehow she seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the family that had owned the mansion. All they knew about the house was that some police officers had seen strange lights moving around inside. Neither Glenn nor myself had researched the house in any manner whatsoever, and it is doubtful that even the most exhaustive search of public records would have turned up the personal minutiae that Irene had siphoned from the psychic atmosphere of the old house. When I asked the caretaker afterward how he would assess Irene's percentage of accuracy, he grinned, and his answer came quickly and easily. I'd have to give her a 90%, he admitted, and it would probably be high. Let's get to this illustration. Medium Irene Hughes. If there was some way to check out every name she gave, just about everything she said fit in. I didn't know how, but she really knew. When we visited the estate on that second night, we had the caretaker and the policeman with us in the station wagon. We opened the gates and drove cautiously down the lane. When we were adjacent to the old house, Glenn stopped the car. Let us just sit quietly for a few moments and permit me to gain some psychic impressions of the house by night, Irene requested, as our medium sat in meditation. I glanced absently out the windshield. Then I blinked my eyes rapidly. There was a glowing mist-like substance forming directly in front of the station wagon's hood. The ghost was beginning to take shape right before my eyes. "What is that?" asked the police officer sitting back beside me in the front seat. This man was not the same open-minded police officer who had accompanied us that afternoon, nor had he been one of the officers who had previously witnessed the glowing entity in the lane. This fellow had joined us earlier that evening and had been openly skeptical, even mocking, toward our efforts of investigating haunting phenomena at the mansion. Because he had declared himself a professional disbeliever in such things as ghosts, I could not resist having a bit of fun with him. "What is what?" I asked blandly. "I don't see anything." "There," he said in a harsh whisper, "right there in front of the car. What in hell is that?" I started to deny seeing anything one more time, but decided against further teasing the officer when I saw that he was nervously brushing the strap that held his service revolver in its holster. It was clear to me that this man was now dealing with something that his police manual had not prepared him for, and that he was having an extremely difficult time fitting the sight of the materializing entity into the world view that he had only moments before held so sacrosanct. At that moment, Glenn whispered over our shoulders in response to our overheard conversation. "I've been watching it for a couple of minutes now," Glenn said. "At first, it was just a wispy tendril that seemed to come from that clump of bushes over there. Then it stopped directly in front of the car and began to take form. By now, everyone in our group observed the glowing mist-like thing. We all sat in silence for a few moments, watching as the orb grew larger and denser and began to assume a human-like form. We decided to get out of the car for a closer inspection. It was a very warm evening, but as I extended my hand into the midst of the glowing mist, I felt its very cold interior. Such a bold act may have been considered very rude by the entity, as the glowing image suddenly vanished. Before we could speculate on the ghost's rapid disappearance, Irene whispered loudly from the other side of the station wagon, "There are some people coming through the bushes by the house." I did not hear the sounds of footsteps and crackling brush myself, but others in the group swore that they could hear the approach of 2 or more people coming toward us. Then the footsteps stopped, and a member of our group directed everyone's attention to the appearance of glowing images between 2 trees. But before any of us could approach them, the lights went out as rapidly as extinguished candle flames. I swear the ghosts looked real to me more than spirit, Irene said. Perhaps Irene's greater sensitivity enabled her to see images where we could only see the glowing mist and orbs. Irene suddenly put her hands on her ears and said that she heard the terrible sound of a woman screaming, there in the bushes," she directed us. "Can you see her head?" Glenn and I told her that we could see a glowing orb, but we were apparently not sensitive enough to tune into the vibrations on the estate and see distinctive features on the entities. Well, there are plenty of vibrations around here to tune into, Irene remarked. This place is just drenched with psychic vibrations. Other than Irene, none of us were able to observe the lights transform into clear images of men and women, and none of our group dared confront any of the glowing lights. It appeared as though the sound portion of the ethereal broadcast had been received well enough, as most of the members of our midnight expedition insisted that they had heard the sounds of footsteps and the brush being parted, but other than Irene's super-sensitive receiving set, the video portion of the program had been blurred. Every member of our party, including the police officer and the caretaker, had seen the ghostly glowing orbs, but only Irene Hughes had been able to adjust the fine-tuned mechanism within her psyche clearly enough to pick up distinct images of the forms that had been preternaturally recorded on the grounds of the old estate. There are a couple of eerie postscripts to this case. The first occurred approximately one calendar year after our visit to this home, when Glenn and I were conducting some follow-up research on the old mansion. We pulled into the lane about midnight in the company of three investigators, only one of whom had visited the place on a prior occasion. We took careful notice of a group of wires that stretched across the lane. Somehow, undoubtedly, the caretaker had strung a number of white and red strips of cloth from the line. We switched off the headlights, got out of the vehicle, and prepared to await the ghost, which had been seen by Glenn and a university professor just a few nights before. We did not have to wait long before a column of light about the height of an average human being appeared to the right of the automobile and made its traditional trek down the lane toward the old mansion. We viewed the glowing orb until it disappeared inside the house, then satisfied that the phenomenon continued unabated, we turned to walk back to the car. As we were approaching the automobile, we were startled to see that a three-time pitchfork had been shoved into the ground and just a few feet in front of the vehicle. We all knew that the pitchfork had not been there before. We had switched off the headlights and began to walk down the lane. The pitchfork had been driven into the ground just in back of the red stripes of cloth on the wire that stretched across the driveway entrance. Since everyone had commented upon this colorful addition to the environment, we would certainly have noticed such an obtrusive element as a pitchfork added to the mix. If that shimmering column of light had truly planted that pitchfork before us, I had to admit that I was becoming concerned that we may have worn out our welcome to the haunted estate. 3 years later, on Halloween, Glenn learned that the old mansion was about to be torn down and replaced by a new home. We drove out to the estate for a farewell viewing, and on that particular occasion, even though it was Halloween, we saw nothing out of the ordinary. We decided that the glowing entity must have learned of the imminent destruction of the mansion and had at last moved on to a higher spiritual plateau. Later that evening, we were invited to stop by a Halloween party in which a number of police officers were in attendance, egged on by one of the officers who had experienced the haunting at the mansion on many different occasions. Glenn and I began to regale the partygoers with some spooky Halloween stories about our encounters with the glowing ghost. The next day, before I left the city to return home, Glenn and one of the police officers stopped by the motel where I was staying to share the perfect capper to the haunting at the mansion. It seems that a couple of the police officers who had attended the Halloween party the night before had been highly skeptical of our accounts of the glowing ghost. Since they had to go on duty after the party, they decided to take the squad car out and to the estate to see for themselves. Amid howls of laughter, Glenn told me that the two officers had sat drinking coffee in the squad car, commenting derisively about our abilities abilities as ghost researchers. Then, to their utter astonishment, the glowing entity materialized directly in front of their squad car, begrudgingly admitting that the two men confessed to their fellow officer that they had burned rubber getting out of the lane from cynics to believers in ghosts in a matter of seconds.